Okay, what I'm doing, that ended chapter 15. Now we move on to chapter 16. Now, don't be surprised if I wind up looking at my notes, my tests, and decide to bring up something else from chapter 13 and 14 later. And I know not 13, but chapter 14. I know in chapter 15 there was a lot. But again, folks, I want to remind you, this is college. And it is not supposed to be easy. But, I don't want to make it unduly difficult. Now, I did have a transfer student from Georgia Tech one time who said that she took a history course at Georgia Tech and my course was harder than that one. I don't mean to make it that way. I don't intend to. But, and again, that's just one person's opinion. I have a second cousin who went to Georgia Tech and they had to go through a lot of paperwork to get in. And well, some of the engineers I worked with at Lockheed also went to Georgia Tech. All right, chapter 16. Now, chapter 16 will be talking about three empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal. I will write those down. Well, I'll write the Ottoman first. None of these empires exist today. Now, before we proceed, though, I want to give you just a little bit of, this is not just this is standard history. These three empires, the title chapter, they're all Muslim. They started out, they were called the gunpowder empires. They started out using gunpowder. They had the best rifles at that time and the best cannon. They had the best flamethrowers with gunpowder, the best grenades, you might say, in the world. And 300 or 400 years later, they were still using the same rifles, the same grenades, the same cannon, while the rest of the world made better cannon, better rifles, and better grenades. And your book will say the same thing that made them was the same thing that destroyed them. Gunpowder made them, gunpowder destroyed them. What went wrong? They did not allow the freedom to dissent. They did not have freedom. And again, I want to be sensitive. There might be Muslims in this class, and you're welcome to hear me. But please give me the freedom to say that what was wrong with Islam, what kept Islam from inventing the automobile, the airplane, the tetanus shot, the polio vaccine, and all what kept them from inventing was they didn't have the freedom to dissent. Inventions are made by people who are allowed to disagree with a norm. And I could name time and time again. Robert Fulton invented a steamship. They laughed at him at first. They called it Fulton's Folly. And when he first tried it out in the Hudson River, it didn't work. And I got Fulton's Folly. He said, give me a few minutes. He fixed it, and all of a sudden the wheels on that ship started turning, and the crowd was put to shame. The steamship worked. Oh yeah, I'm ashamed to say this more, but a college professor in 1903 wrote an article that man would never fly a heavier-than-air machine. In December 1903, two Ohioans flew a heavier-than-air machine named Wilbur Norval Wright. Because he proved the problem was his mathematics were right, except it didn't include figures that should have been put in these equations. But anyway, the freedom to disagree, the freedom to speak out, very, very, very important. And this was something these empires lacked. Now, your books opens up that eventually Europeans made the Indian Ocean into a European lake, and if you look on a map, the Indian Ocean is off the coast of India, but also it's off the coast of some Muslim countries. What went wrong? Well, Europeans developed better cannon. Cannon could shoot farther, yeah, better. So basically what this meant was when a Portuguese ship met a Muslim ship, the Portuguese captain could begin firing before the Muslim ship could, And of course, granted, firing from a distance, some of the cannonballs missed. I mean, especially, you might be aware, firing in an ocean, you might aim accurately, and all of a sudden a wave just knock your boat up, or a wave knock your boat down a little bit. You're going to miss several. But if you keep firing, you're going to hit. The Portuguese sailors would hit the Muslim ships before the Muslim ships could get close enough to start firing, because they had better cannon. All right, the Ottoman Empire first. The Ottoman Empire is located in what is today Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was destined to last until the end of World War II, when it came to an end. The Turks, all right, wave after wave of Mongolians throughout history comes from Central Asia. Like who? Well, first it was the Huns. We don't know exactly where the Huns came from originally, but they came from Central Asia, came from the east. And then there was the, don't write this down, the Bulgars, the Magyars, the Turks, the Mongolians, and two types of Turks, Seljuk Turks. These people all, oh yeah, the Finns, the Avars, these people all came in wave after wave from Mongolia, and they would settle in Europe. And of course, if you know anything about Mongolia, it's a dry country. Mongolia is very dry, and after a while they'd have a lot of babies, and they could not support all the children they had, and they couldn't support all the flocks and herds that were born, so they just all start traveling by the tens of thousands. And sometimes they created havoc in Europe, but eventually they found places to settle down in Europe, and they'd settle in Europe. A lot of times they became Europeanized, but the Turks never did. Anyway, they settled in what is today Turkey. Now, they eventually began to expand into Europe. Their rulers claimed the title of Sultan. Yeah, we still have a few sultans, I believe, in the world today. It basically is another word for king. Well, these Turks began to force Christians to become Muslim. Now, I want to say this about forcing people to become Muslim. You cannot make one blanket statement and apply it to all situations. Some rulers did and some didn't. Some generations did and some didn't. And in some places they did, in other places they didn't. So it wasn't in every case. But in this case, the Turks did force the people in Turkey to become Muslim. And most of them did. Some did not. All right. Now, eventually, now here's what I remember about him. I read a book about this once, but very important. Constantinople was the last city of the old Byzantine Empire. Mehmet II captured Constantinople. Constantinople, and they changed its name to Istanbul. Now, more than 55 years ago, when I was a kid, we'd hear advertised for Kellogg's cornflakes, and one of the questions, what's the corniest city on earth? The corniest city on earth is Constantinople. The other one said, yeah, but they changed its name to Istanbul. Yeah, ear. You know, corn grows on ears. All right. That's why I don't tell secrets in a cornfield. There are too many ears. Oh, no. Anyway, it changed its name from Constantinople to Istanbul, and today it's still called Istanbul. Anyway, Mehmet II, this was the end of the Byzantine Empire. Then Mehmet II went on and tried to go on and make headway into Eastern Europe. However, basically, if this were Europe, I'll draw like a crude map. And this were Turkey over here. Essentially, the Muslims were trying to capture Europe by coming in from both the east and the west. But by 1453, when Constantinople was captured, most of the Muslims had been driven out of Spain, Then Ferdinand and Isabella used cannon that were better than any cannon the Muslims had. Again, they didn't make these cannons, so they bought them. But they bought some cannon, and with better weaponry, they were able to drive the last of the Muslims out of Spain. The year was 1492, the year that Columbus discovered America. Once Ferdinand and Isabella had driven the Muslims out of Spain, then they felt free to give Columbus 3 ships. Now, Spain is one of the few countries in the world that was ever taken over by Islam that was able to drive the Islams out. In fact, I think it's the only country that drove them out without help from outside. Now, it's true Greece drove them out, but Greece had a lot of help from France. But in the meantime, though, having captured Constantinople, the Turks began to move into Eastern Europe. They got Serbia, Kosovo, and to this day, particularly during the Clinton administration, there was trouble in Kosovo that can be traced back to this time when the Islamic people made inroads into Eastern Europe. But they were eventually stopped. Now, 2 times they got to the city of Vienna. Now, all right, when the Turks went to Constantinople, Europeans did not come to the aid of Constantinople. But when the Muslims got to Vienna, Austria, the capital of Austria, they did it twice, around 1580 and around 1684, somewhere like that. They're about 100 years apart. Every time the Muslims got to Vienna, other European countries sent armies in to help. Particularly Poland sent a big army in, and some of your Italian states did. And they caught the Muslims by surprise and drove the Muslims out. But folks, recently, as a little more than 330 years ago, the Muslims actually got to Vienna, Austria. But they were driven out. Let's see. Now, the Turks began to push westward across North Africa. They got almost to the Strait of Gibraltar over here. I mean, you know, Spain, or Africa and Spain, there's a almost meet in the Mediterranean. There's a huge, huge rock called the Rock of Gibraltar. Again, Europeans were able to keep them out. Now, where this leads to, folk, is eventually all these Muslim nations were conquered, owing to the fact that their technology fell too far behind. That was the main. I mean, hey, the war. All right, now let me tell you, the war between Islam and everybody else has been going on for about 12, 13, 1400 years. 1400 years, and there is no end in sight. That long. The Crusades were part of this long ongoing war. The Crusades were part of it, and then after the Crusades were over with, well, if the Crusades ended when the Black Death hit Europe, Europe was in no position to mount an offensive. But then as the Black Death died out, Islam began to assert itself, and Europeans were able to fight them off. But eventually, after 1684, so the technological revolution, industrial revolution took over, and Europeans developed the steamship and developed much, much better rifles, better cannon, and the locomotive. Islam did not invent any of this. Islam had none of this. And Islam fell way behind, and almost every Islamic country wound up being conquered. Now, the Muslims moved into Ethiopia to try to conquer the African country of Ethiopia. Islam there lost also, thanks to help from the Portuguese. The Portuguese moved in with their better rifles, which they also gave to the Ethiopians, and they helped the Ethiopians fight off Islam. There was a story that there was a Christian kingdom somewhere in Africa ruled by a man named Prester John. This kingdom never existed, Prester John never existed, but the Europeans hoped that they'd someday run into Prester John, and between them and Prester John's kingdom, they would completely crush Islam. It never happened. All right.
Well,
Yes.
What was that border between Spain and Africa called?
Well, there was no border. The rock was the Rock of Gibraltar. See,
Yeah.
between Spain and Africa, there's the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean Sea is, and then on the Spain side, there's a big, big rock called the Rock of Gibraltar. I mean, the rock is, I think, about 3 miles long. I mean, it's one big rock. One of the biggest rocks there is above the surface. The last account I had, Great Britain owned the rock, and in time of war, the British would control that rock, and they would not let any enemy ship get through into the Mediterranean Sea. But anyway, the Muslims were not able to get the Rock of Gibraltar. Essentially, Islam had reached a high point of its existence and was starting to its long road to decline. And the decline was to get worse and worse and worse as time went on. All right. Now, the Turks conquered Hungary for a while, but then a European coalition, several European nations got together and drove the Turks out of Hungary. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make is Islam was on its way, still trying to conquer the world. But two things kept them from conquering the world. Number one, they started fighting among themselves. And this is still going on. I mean, okay, right now, today, Syria is fighting Syria. Egypt is still fighting Egypt. Libya is fighting Libya. And Arabia is fighting its neighbor to the south, Yemen, I believe. And anybody who knows more about it now can correct me on that. Basically, they're fighting among themselves still. They've always done this. And the other thing was technologically they fell behind. All the technology was invented by the Europeans and left them behind. And they still wonder what is the reason. All right, backing up a little bit, before 1500, if you could have visited the earth in the year 1000 from another planet, you'd find the Islamic world was far ahead of Europe. They had hospitals, Europe didn't. They had better medicine than Europe had. They had better weaponry. They were cleaner than Europeans. And then fast forward to 1500, or it's actually fast forward to 1600, 1650 and 1700, the Muslim world fell behind. All right. What was Turkish rule like? All right, well, I've got to say this, folk. I mean, there's a story in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, where that the ancestor of the Muslims, named Ishmael, an angel appeared to Ishmael's mother and said to Ishmael's mother, Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everybody, and everybody's hand will be against him. I mean, you don't have to write that down, but if that doesn't describe what's been the story of Islam. I mean, their hand has been against everybody, constantly fighting, constantly at war, and this is just as true today as it was before. Now, the Sultan. The private domain of the Sultan was the harem. The harem was basically where the Sultan kept his many wives. In other words, the harem was a big part of the Sultan's palace, and in one section of the harem would live one wife with her children, and another section would live another wife with her children. The Sultan would almost never define who was to succeed him, and every one of these wives would hope that my son will succeed and become the next Sultan. So when the Sultan died, there was always a power struggle, and the person who survived in the power struggle, he became the next Sultan. Basically, it was whoever killed off the other contenders would become the next Sultan. This was to go on for generations. That is why in our country we have an office of vice president. When the president dies or resigns, everybody knows who's to take over. But in these countries, nobody knew who was going to take over, and it was not decided by vote, it was decided by warfare. And whoever came out on top when the bloody war was over, won. You know, the harem, private domain of the Sultan, where the Sultan's many, many wives were kept. The Sultans did not marry. They simply had what you call concubines. The concubines would try to make sure they had a son. I mean, of course, obviously half the babies that were born were daughters, but each concubine would hope she had a son. The purpose of not actually taking a wife, now the word concubine means a person who's not quite a wife, but who nevertheless cohabits with the sultan. The purpose of not having a wife was supposedly to keep any one of his sons from rising up and killing him. That was the whole, or each sultan lived in constant fear that he was going to be assassinated when they were poisoned one day. And they would have cupbearers, and every time the sultan wanted to drink, a cupbearer would bring more. Then the cupbearer would drink from the cup himself to show that it was not poison and hand it to the sultan. They might think, isn't this unsanitary? They didn't know that at the time. Or the cupbearer would, if the sultan wanted to eat, the cupbearer would eat from the sultan's plate first to show that the food was not poisoned. Then the sultan himself would eat from it. But they were living in constant fear of being poisoned, of being shot, of being assassinated. Many of them were. So they did not have wives. That way, there was no real heir. And that way, they believed that no one would take the throne. They didn't care that after they died, there was going to be a power struggle, and they figured, hey, what's the big deal? Well, I'm gone anyway, and I don't care what happens after I'm gone. The Sultan's chief minister was known as a Grand Vizier or Grand Vizier. I'm not going to write that down. But basically, the Grand Vizier was like the Prime Minister. All kings had a Prime Minister. In other words, a king, big king, but then he would have his right-hand man, the Prime Minister, who would do a whole lot of the work for him. A lot of his letter writing, a lot of his corresponding with ambassadors, and well, carrying out the king's orders. The king wanted something done, then the Prime Minister would go see that it was carried out. But in the case of Sultan, the Prime Minister was the Grand Vizier. Religion, they had two types of Muslims, Sunni or Shiite, and I'm not going to ask you to learn the difference now. I get them mixed up, but there are the two types, the Sunni and the Shiite. Most of the rulers were Sunni. Eventually, some of them took the title of Caliph. The title of Caliph meant defender of the faith. In other words, Sultan, that was a political term. Caliph was a religious term. In other words, we're head of, it's more like the King of England took the title of head of the church. And to this day, Queen Elizabeth is still considered head of the Church of England. That's why there's a move to bypass Prince Charles, because it said Prince Charles cannot be head of the Church of England because his morality is not high enough. The Queen herself, her morals are almost perfect. Prince Charles, her son, can't say the same for him. Now, the Muslims were never able to convert everybody from Christianity to Islam, or from Judaism either. So Jews and Christians there were always Jewish and Christian communities inside the territory. Now, I heard a Christian man speak one time at a church, and he said that down through history, while the Muslims were continually fighting other Muslims, Christian intermediaries would often come in and serve as peacekeepers, peacekeeping intermediaries to try to quell the fights between one group of Muslims and another. But they spent a lot of time fighting among themselves. Again, not being critical so much as just stating a fact. Merchants, oftentimes Muslim merchants became wealthy by trade. Well, make a long story, well, not really short, but eventually the inevitable happened, and a ruler came along named Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent built himself up an empire and became very powerful, but he carried on constant wars that depleted the treasury. Palace fights became common. A lot of these rulers resorted to drinking alcohol, and you might have said, I heard that Islam teaches against alcohol. Yes, it does, but that did not keep the Muslim rulers from indulging in it. And like anyone else, they became addicted. And I heard someone say that in the Islamic world, if a person drinks, he's more likely than any of the rest of us to become addicted, because we've been drinking for generations and they haven't. So when they drink, they have no resistance to it. And they drink and quickly become addicted to it. But don't get me wrong, anybody who drinks can become addicted. You don't know if you're alcoholic until you become one. There are things you look for. Now, I will tell you, I've suspected for years that I am a dry alcoholic. And if anyone was a dry alcoholic, my father would. Hey, don't get me wrong, the man never took a drink. Never touched, I haven't touched his stuff, and I'm not about to. But some of my relatives on my father's side have, and they've become addicted. Particularly a niece of mine has really had a problem with it. And one of my brothers had a problem with it before he quit. So I think I'm an alcoholic, but I'm not going to try to I never want to find out. But anyway, it can grab you and not let go. Anyway, a problem they had too was Western traditions and Western customs, Western dress made their way into the harem. A lot of times these women would see a European woman and say, I want to dress like her. And of course, this created a lot of problems. Coffee, tobacco. Yes, Islam teaches against both coffee and tobacco, especially tobacco. Now, Muhammad never came across tobacco himself, but when tobacco was brought in from the New World, Islamic clerics started teaching against it. They suspected it was harmful, and they knew quite early it was addictive. I hope all of you know, I've heard the most addictive substance you can take. Not the worst, but the most addictive is tobacco. Now, if any of you have heard otherwise, you're welcome to, your input is welcome.
Weed.
Weed?
Yeah.
But I've heard of, okay. Don't get me wrong, I'm not about to take any of it. I'm not to take it, I have a son who argues that weed is not addictive. I don't believe it. The weed that you're being sold today, folk, is not the weed that was sold 50 years ago when I was about the time I was your age. Not at all. I mean, some of you have heard that. The weed that's going around today is, hey, they bred it and crossbred it until it's a hard drug. I see a lot of heads nodding. I'm glad you all think, most of you appear to think so. Anyway, the weed that's being on today, number one, it destroys brain cells, and number two, it's addictive. Now, if any of you want to argue that, go ahead. I'll listen. I won't argue. I'll listen. Nobody? All right. But anyway, younger sons were often caged to keep them from, and then when the sultan died, they were let out of the cage and had no ability at all to rule because they did not understand people. Eventually, Suleiman's empire came to an end. The Ottoman Empire was to last till 1918, when World War I ended it. But it was called the sick man of Europe for many generations. Turkey was known as the weak place of Europe, the sick man. It lagged behind the rest of Europe in every way, technologically, every way. In the case of Suleiman the Magnificent himself, he executed all of his sons except for his most drunken son, and put that drunken son on a throne, and the result was disastrous. All right, so much for the Ottomans. Keep them in mind, because we're going to talk more about the Ottomans, how that they were, they were put down in Europe. Turkey is considered part of Europe. Now, the Safavids. That area covers what is today Iran, otherwise once known as Persia. The borders changed often. Again, the Safavids, like the Ottomans, they were constantly in war a lot. Their rulers got the title, and so those of you who, I don't know how many of you heard this title, the rulers took the title of Shah. there was the title Shah was to make news, big time news, all for many generations, particularly in 1979 when the last Shah developed cancer and came to the United States, and the Iranian people rose up and took 52 American hostages. This was in 1979, and those Iranian hostages were some 400 days before they were finally released. But these Safavid rulers had the title of Shah. Don't ask me why they didn't take the title like everyone else, but they were. All right. Now, the Shiite branch of Islam began to become somewhat mystical. I'm not going to write this down. But, all right, well, I will try to explain what's going on here. Every once in a while, you'll find someone who seems to work miracles. And again, most of you probably are not religious persons. I mean, that's okay, but religious people are looking for someone who can like heal sick or foretell the future. And Islam is no exception. They look for persons to come along who has gifts, gift of prophecy, the gift of healing or whatever. And the Shiite branch of Islam produced a lot of these people who claim to have these gifts. And Christianity has produced people like this also. If you study Christian history, occasionally it could be either male or female, man or woman, who'd come along and claim that they could foretell the future or perform miracles or heal the sick or whatever. And anyway, the Safavids fought against the Ottomans, and neither side could win. The Ottomans would fight the Safavids, neither side could win. The wars lasted a long time and eventually brought down both empires. The Shah was looked on as being somewhat almost divine, and it was, again, this was not what Muhammad taught. He taught that the ruler was not divine, but again, as time went on, each branch of Islam would develop its own thing. All right, with that, now here's the line in your, this is in your book, folk. Intellectual freedom was curtailed. That explains why these empires did not last and fell behind the rest of the world. Intellectual freedom curtailed. Then women. Now this was true particularly among the Safavids. Women were forced to hide in seclusion and wear the veil. And to this day, a lot of Muslim women will wear the veil. And the veil is a symbol of complete, total submission. And Muslim women are looked on as being property with no freedom of their own. Now, this is true, especially among the Safavids. Now, I mean, okay, don't accuse me of making a blanket statement. You can't make a blanket statement, folk. But a lot of Muslim women were, in fact, forced into hiding, into seclusion, and not allowed out, and they were considered complete property of their husbands. And this has gone on up until modern times.